Hello and welcome to week 11 in the psychology of personality. And we're going to be taking on two chapters, capturing two of the major followers or theoreticians, I just made that up, theorists who were students of Sigmund Freud and then broke away for reasons that are germane to the theories that they came up with that remain very powerful and influential theories in understanding of personality today. So, if you look at the history of psychology, you may see reference to the idea that Sigmund Freud, among other things, is the father of developmental psychology, or the perception that things dynamically change over time. And certainly, if you look at his theory, psychosexual stages, where you're looking at, the oral, anal, genital, latent, and then into adolescence, and look at that model as the movement of energy that will eventually, in adults, become the motivation for procreation and the continuing of the species, really giving a lot of weight on the evolutionary aspect and instincts and whatnot that Freud focused on. He does represent this sort of first notion of a psychological theory that describes qualitative changes in the personality in early life. Now, because Freud's focus was on the interaction between the developing psyche and the physiological locations of sensation that delivered pleasure, this sexuality, psychosexual relationship, along came Erik Erikson, and he felt, and broke with Freud, that he felt the major challenges faced by the developing psyche were not so much the physiological pleasure-seeking stuff that Freud was talking about, but the society and cultural expectations that they're placed in the social atmosphere. So we have the introduction, we have the psychosexual stages, and then Erikson comes along and says he thinks that they're psychosocial stages. And he coined that term, that psychosocial, which we use all over the place now, coined that term. And he also broke with Freud that he felt that there were stages that existed beyond young adulthood, early, late adolescence and young adulthood, which Freud pretty much felt the personality was done developing at that time, and Erikson said no. Those two factors were the theoretical reasons for the schism between Freud and Erikson. So when we look at Erikson's theory, and in this course book, I created a table, and we're looking at the ages and the stages, all represented by a dichotomy. So in the earliest stage, you have trust versus mistrust, and you have autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role diffusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, integrity versus despair. And then Joan Erikson, his wife, kicking in with the ninth stage, very old age, despair versus gerotranscendence. Now, each of these represent the developing personality within the context of the social world in which that individual exists. So you look over to the social institution, goal, those kinds of things, and you see hope, will, purpose, competence, fidelity, love, care, wisdom, and transcendence. Really, that these are Erikson's descriptions of the way in which our personalities are shaped by the challenges that exist, the expectations that exist, the regular life course events that happen over the course of the lifespan. Now, for the sake of this chapter, I introduced at this point couple other theories. We talk about Marcia's theory, closely related to Erikson's theory, because what Marcia did is he talked about identity status. I do believe that I've mentioned this before in the class. I mention it all over my classes. One of my favorite models for understanding identity development. And that is that if you took a snapshot of an individual, looked at one aspect of their identity, let's take a look at your current career identity. So, well, you have an idea. You're in college because you have an idea about what you want to do, a different kind of job and whatnot, and you're preparing for that. So the way that Marcia's theory looks at identity is from a constructivist point of view, meaning an individual who is working on that aspect of their identity, that identity will exist, their career identity will exist in any one of four different statuses. And those statuses are defined by the presence or absence of what he referred to as commitment, meaning I have selected my path, and crisis, which means I'm still looking at the different paths. Okay, so if there was no commitment or no commitment and no search of paths and no commitment, sort of on the back burner, we sort of call that, let's take a look at that here. We call that diffusion. It's diffused. I'm not back burner. Let's say, however, that that aspect of my identity, your career identity, you grew up in a family of mechanics throughout your life. You were expected to become a mechanic. Your parents changed the sign to reflect that you're going to be, like say Smith and Sons or Smith and Daughters. Everybody's going to be a mechanic. And you sort of feel like, wow, that's what everybody's expecting me to do. You can have a sense of foreclosure, meaning I've selected, but I never really got a chance to look at the options. Now then, let's look at the other thing. Let's say we are actively currently looking at the options. Let's say you're making your way through your degree right now. Whatever degree you're getting in, you're looking at graduation and you're looking at, well, what am I going to do with this now? Here are my options. I'm going to have this degree. That degree allows me some flexibility to sell my time. What do I want to do with it? And you're looking at different jobs. You might be thinking about that very actively right now. So you are in a state of what Marcia called moratorium. And then ultimately, when you've gone through the process of looking at the options and you pick one, commit to it, you go into identity achievement. You can see that on the graphic here in the course book. We have the crisis, whether the crisis is or was present or whether it is absent. And then you have the levels of commitment, either it's present or absent in this graphic. So this idea of in Erikson's stages, all the different decisions that we make in constructing our identity are here. And at different stages of life, there's some that are, when you're 12 years old, you're not really thinking about your retirement plans. So that's in diffusion. But you might be looking at what courses you're going to take and start in junior high and high school and start thinking about your future. So you're in moratorium in terms of that. When you're 15, you might be interested in dating. So you're sort of looking at the options that are available, and then you might pick a person and you make a, temporary, maybe permanent commitment to that individual. I'm going to stop looking at the others. Maybe not. Maybe you might consider that you can be commitment while you're still looking at the options. That's an argument to work out elsewhere. But nonetheless, we have this theory that describes a whole bunch of aspects of our identity and their current status. Now, along comes my theory, puzzle pieces. So from those areas, from Erikson, those kind of life stages, changes and whatnot, into this idea of Marcia's theory, I developed this notion of puzzle pieces. And what it is, it's a simple analogy of the human identity as a collection of small pieces, all made up of parts of our identity, all of which may be in any one of those statuses. Think of that jigsaw puzzle. Some pieces have been made for us. Those are our foreclosed pieces. Some pieces we're shaping right now. We're actively working on shaping those pieces. Others, we're all set with those. We've looked at the options. Those are pretty permanent. Other things, other parts of the puzzle we're not even worried about right now. We're not even working on that picture. And ultimately, at the end, we have constructed a combination of foreclosed and achieved aspects of our identity, a picture, a complex psychological identity picture of who we are. So this is both a combination of Erickson's stage theory and the cognitive constructionist theory about how we actively engage in the creation of that identity. So, and then, going to Erickson, and we look at how influences in our social world can bring about foreclosure. So in Erickson's theory, if there's good and bad, we depending on our early childhood experiences, we may develop a sense of basic trust, basic mistrust, and those become aspects of our identity. They become major pieces in that jigsaw puzzle that is me, that have been foreclosed because of those experiences or trauma experiences. But then also joyous, transcending experiences can become permanent aspects of our identity simply due to outside forces. In the discussion, I want you to look at Marcia's theory. Now, we can look at Marcia's theory as developmental, or we can look at it as essentially a status. What are things like now? So we can take a part of our identity, and we can say when it was diffused, when it went into moratorium, then commitment, and then maybe something happened and you went back into foreclosed, and then you started looking at the option again. And we could take that one piece of our identity and we can track it as it's navigated and changed status over time. Or we can take a snapshot of us and we can look at 4 different aspects of our identity and place them, an example of a part of your identity that's in diffusion, on the back burner, an example of your identity that is in moratorium, actively looking at that, an aspect of your identity that is foreclosed, that's done, and you're not looking at the options, and of course, an aspect of your identity that is an achieved. So the discussion is to self-identify aspects of your identity that fit into any one of those 4 statuses. You could also have some discussion about how they've changed over time. So if you were committed to a particular job and then you lost that job, that would put you into foreclosed. You lost it because it's gone away or because you got fired or anything like that, and it moves you into a foreclosed identity. Now, unemployed didn't mean to be unemployed. You might stay there for a while, a little depressed, that's fine, but then you might quickly move over to moratorium. Now I need to find something else. And then when I find that something else, I move back into achieved. So you can do that discussion, but what I'm really looking for is a variety of different statuses of your identity that reflect the different stages that we see, the different statuses that we see in Marcia's theory. The quiz, what I want you to do is to look at Erickson's theory. We can go back to that. Look at Erickson's theory here. And again, it's not going to be really big on your screen, but this is in the course book on page 216. Find where you are here. Most of you are going to be somewhere between young adulthood and adulthood and whatnot, maybe even to old age. Maybe some adolescence in here. Maybe some, there's a new stage in between adolescence and young adult. So emerging adulthood, you'd be in there. But you look at where you are, you identify where you are, and then discuss the stages prior to that have brought you to where you are, the influence of those previous stages. That's another thing that Freud gave us, was this notion that not only is our early development divided into qualitatively different stages, but previous stages influence the outcomes of subsequent stages. So early life experiences impact later life experiences. That's another very important part of Erikson's theory that came along. So that is the discussion and the quiz for chapter 12. We now move to another student of Freud. In fact, Carl Jung was arguably Freud's favorite. He was the individual that he himself had identified as the person he was going to pass the psychodynamic theory torch to carry on his work into the next generation. And his break with Carl Jung was a significant psychological blow to Freud's life and impacted him for the rest of his life. So a little biography associated with that. Carl Jung is probably most famous for his focus on an aspect of Freud's psychodynamic theory of id, ego, and superego structures within the personality that are exchanging energies, that are sometimes in conflict with each other and whatnot. And his focus, now use the analogy of that we often see of Freud's theory. We have an iceberg sitting in the ocean, and that iceberg represents the personality. And the personality, the part of the iceberg that we see, is the ego. Below the water, below our consciousness, represented by the iceberg below the water, are the unconscious forces of the id and the superego. Now, the analogy carries because Freud felt that most of our personality is beneath our awareness, just like most of an iceberg is beneath the water. So that's how that analogy rings to be a very good descriptor of Freud's theory. Carl Jung came along and said, oh, what about the ocean? What's in the ocean? You know, I don't know if he ever said that literally, but in our analogy, our personalities are floating. You know, we have this iceberg representing our personality, but what about the ocean that it's in? And he focused his work on the unconscious as a space where our unconscious aspects of our identity, personality reside. And components of that unconscious space that may be shared with other people, meaning we're all floating in the ocean, and it might be that there underneath the waves that there is a different kind of connection with other people that exist underneath our awareness, that there might be aspects of the ocean that influence our superegos and ids in ways that we're not aware of. So he went into what we now refer to a lot as depth psychology. Again, we sort of get the analogy of water there, but in the unconscious. And he introduced concepts like the collective unconscious, which is that the ocean represents a shared unconscious world in which our personality resides, sharing with everybody in the world, maybe in the universe. Then there was archetypes, which were symbolic representations of major aspects of our personality, such as the feminine and masculine, the anima and animus aspects of our personality, the shadow, the dark side of our personalities, each one of those that sort of identified these. Then we see symbols. These are shapes and forms that exist within our collective cultures, that he identified that across different cultures in the world, there were sounds, there were shapes, there were colors that had shared meaning even though those cultures had never really communicated with each other. So his instance of the mandala, or the circle, basically representing wholeness, completeness, God, the universe, everything, all of that thing, that concept is shared universally. So he attributed that to aspects of the collective unconscious. Exploring that, came up with the notion that that iceberg floating is influenced by those aspects of the collective unconscious, and it results in certain types of people. Now, from there, we take this pretty impressive leap from depth psychology into the world of the Myers-Briggs typology. Now, the Myers-Briggs is a personality test, probably one of the more famous personality tests, most widely used personality tests. It's a normative personality test. It doesn't measure abnormal behavior like the like other tests do. It does, however, measure personality types along 4 dimensions. And so, catching up on my notes here. So Carl Jung introduces this idea of opposites, such as yin and yang, male, female, outside, inside, all of these, that these are fundamental philosophical aspects of our personality. And then, make sure I get this right here, he introduced personality types along fundamental dichotomies of like yin and yang, and she had so extroversion versus introversion, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition. We can kind of look at these as, the extroversion, introversion is like a person gaining energy by being around people and dynamically interacting with them socially. An introverted person gaining energy through solitude. Doesn't keep an introverted person from being extroverted, doesn't keep an extroverted person from seeking alone time. It's just there are distinctions between people who prefer one or the other. Then you have thinking versus feeling, where an individual is using logic to make decisions or they're going with gut instincts. The kind of different types of people there. And then the third one, sensing versus intuition. Sensing is show me the data. Intuition is, again, more of that gut feeling about how do I gather information. The developers, Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers, were the developers, mother and daughter team, who developed a paper and pencil test. Wow. We can fill out a test in order to determine where you are in each one of those dynamics. And they added another one called perceiving and judging. And they developed what we now know as the Myers-Briggs Personality Type Inventory, MBTI, of which I am a certified test giver, administrator. That's it. That's the word I was looking for. I can administer the Myers-Briggs. Very into what it provides some very interesting and useful points of discussion. And I'm going to have you play around with the idea of a Myers-Briggs. Now, mind you, I'm a certified practitioner, so I gotta say it. The free tests that are out there are not as good as the real thing, but you got to pay for the real thing. So I put in the course book a link to a Myers-Briggs personality test. And I'm going to be asking you to take that test to explore your type. There are innumerable resources on the web for personality type. You just put in your 4 letters and you'll get hits after hits after hits. But I also put in there a link for a website that I use called Type Logic, or I used before I became certified. The Myers-Briggs company has way more information on these and other levels of analysis and whatnot. And so it's an opportunity for you to play around with that. Many people that I introduced this to have said they've taken the test before. That's fine. Take it again. See if you have the same thing. Cautionary tale. The Myers-Briggs is often under attack within the world of psychology as being not so reliable. And that, rather than looking upon that as a defeat within the world of Myers-Briggs personality testing, it's actually, for me personally, and I'm not representing Myers-Briggs on this, but for me personally, what it actually represents is a dynamic aspect of adaptation that the personality has over time. So we're looking at, if we're going to define personality as unchanging aspects of our behavior that occur across different situations, that is different than relatively stable yet malleable, adaptable changes that we can make in our personality over time, which I think is best represented by Myers-Briggs. Somewhat by the big five as well. Sometimes people move from extroversion to introversion. They move from openness to not so open. That's sort of a general trend as we get older. So within the notion of personality theory, this debate specifically about the validity of the Myers-Briggs really brings to the front the argument right now. Is personality a fixed entity or is it dynamic? Does it change over time? And that's really the fundamental question about the Myers-Briggs. So the last topic that I introduced here is a concept called happenstance. I usually introduce this concept when I'm talking about career development. It's a very active and prominent theory within career development that manifests from the reality that when we interview people who are very, very happy in their work, we find out that many of them may have never planned to do that kind of work in the first place. The reason why they're in that work is because of some sort of chance happening. They're standing in the line at Dunkin' Donuts waiting to get their donut and pick up a conversation with someone, and that leads to another meeting and another time, and then suddenly they're in their dream job. They never thought they would be doing this. Maybe they didn't even know that kind of work existed. So it's a nod, this theory is a nod to the idea that our identity as it relates to specific aspects of our personality and whatnot can be influenced by chance events. Now, not Freud, but Carl Jung would say they're not accidental. He referred to that as synchronicity. So synchronicity was when, the unconscious aspects of our identity made sure that person A and person B were going to be at the same Dunkin' Donuts that day because they had a plan below our consciousness. And it gets into some pretty aspects, some pretty deep aspects, no pun intended, of our depth psychology perspective that are often very much pushed aside by modern psychology. But yet, incredible coincidence. Carl Jung didn't believe in coincidence. He felt that these things were managed below our consciousness. That's why it appears here, because Carl Jung felt that we call it by chance, just chance events. Carl Jung didn't think they were by chance. So I want you to think about all of those things. So along with our chapter 12 discussion and quiz, there are two more discussions. Chapter 13, discussion A, asks you to take a look at Carl Jung's notion of balance, that of balance in your life from Carl Jung's perspective. I want you to do that. Then we're going to look at happenstance. Now, the shaping and construction of your personality doesn't necessarily need to be only in the field of career. You may be at UMA because you were thinking about going to college and you had a doctor's appointment and the nurse came in and they were talking to you and said, so where did you go to school? And they said, I went to UMA. And then you're like, oh, I'll check it out. And here you are at UMA. Happenstance. Person that put that little bug in your ear and you went off, checked it out. Maybe you didn't even look at we didn't look at any other colleges. You didn't engage any of that James Marcia stuff. You just like, I'm done. I looked at the one. I like it. It's close. It's affordable. I'm going there. And my favorite nurse went there. So that kind of decision happening because of happenstance. And then finally, for the assignment, we're going to go to the Myers-Briggs. You take that test and you get somebody else close to you, your partner, a good friend and whatnot. They take the test, look at your results, and figure out, why are you still friends? How do you complement each other? Are there aspects of your personality that are alike? And that certainly makes things run smoothly. Are there aspects of your personality that are in opposition to each other, but serve to balance each other? Again, back up to that discussion on balance. This idea that we can balance each other out. I hope you see also that in that train of thought is where we get the idea that there's someone out there who is my soulmate. That entire philosophy is germane to the collective unconscious. That aspects of my personality are seeking another person out there in the ocean, trying to work things out so people get together by happenstance, but not really, according to Carl Jung, so that individuals can complement each other. So every one of these discussions is related if we look at the notion of soulmates. Again, a concept that is largely rejected within the psychological world, but largely embraced within experiences that people have had, where they've met Mr. and Mrs. Right or whatever, and certainly with some bad fish along the way, maybe that you got on, maybe a couple sharks, maybe a couple eels, maybe a squid. I don't know, I don't know how you're going to define those people that you went through until you found the dolphin that represents the individual that, or maybe you're still trying to seek the dolphin. Maybe you're still with a squid. I don't know. So you can think about that. But that's the kind of a connection between all of those assignments right now of achieving balance, complementary aspects of your personality as measured by the Myers-Briggs, and then instances by which happenstance, chance, maybe it's your collective unconscious working with you, how those experiences have happened in your life. So that's this week. Lots of stuff, but lots of really good introspection, lots of opportunity to share some really good life stories with each other and advance this learning. So okay, I look forward to that. I will see you in these 3 discussions. That's a lot of discussions to cover over a week, but we can do it. And I will see you online. Take care.